on Earth. The ancient Egyptians believed that as long as the sun came up every day, there'd always be life on Earth. Therefore, quite logically, the sun became the representation for everlasting life. Put it another way, if the sun comes up every day, food will grow. If food grows, people can live and can reproduce. So that when you die, your son can carry on. And when he dies, his son will carry on, and so forth. So that as long as the sun, the light of the world, comes up every day, there will be everlasting life on Earth. So quite logically, every major religion and mystic belief features the sun as its principal and most important feature.
The Egyptians noticed that on their sundials, that in winter, as the sun moved further south, bringing, of course, our winter, that winter represents death, the coldness of death. And they noticed that when the sun went south, that it reached a point where it stopped in its movement and did not move any further south. And they began to notice on their sundials that it not only didn't go any further south, but it didn't begin to move back north either for 3 days. For 3 days, the sun set exactly on the sundial in the same place. Therefore, the ancients said that the Son of God dies for 3 days and is resurrected or brought back to life once it begins its annual journey back to the northern hemisphere. And when it begins its annual journey back to the northern hemisphere was on December 25th. Therefore, God's Son, the light of the world, who is our salvation because he is risen, was born or reborn on December 25th. Of course, the sun represented to the ancient people salvation because they believed, especially the Egyptians said, that they noticed that if the sun continues to come up every morning, that life would continue on. When the sun comes up, the children awake, the men go off to work, and the world continues, and the flowers grow, and there will always be life on the earth as long as the sun comes up. As long as the sun is risen, there will always be life. Therefore, the Egyptians said that the Son of God, the light of the world, represented everlasting life on the earth. Not for you, but on the earth, everlasting life. That the Egyptians realized that the sun, while burning, was giving up energy, and that the plants and the food chain on earth was receiving, along with the humans and animals, were receiving the energy from the sun. Therefore, the sun was giving up its life for us.
Here are a few churches that we drove by. They're all completely unrelated, but nevertheless, they all display the cross. But within that cross is a circle.
The church we're at now is a Presbyterian church, and as you would expect to find on any church, it does, of course, have a cross on top. But if you look more closely at many of these crosses, you'll find that there is also a circle within the cross. The circle is on the cross of the zodiac, and that circle represents the sun which comes up every day. But over the ages, man began to refer to this as the Son of God, and therefore it became God's Son. But what a cross with a circle in it like this truly represents is the sun waning or dying on the cross of the zodiac, and not a man.
The Son of God, God's Son, dies on the cross of the zodiac. The sun, the round orb that comes up in the morning, is what is correctly pictured on the cross, and not a man. This church tells the whole zodiological story. The dying on the cross of the zodiac, and this small circle surrounded by 12 helpers, or houses of the zodiac. Anyone can see that this is indeed a round orb with 12 signs or houses around it. It is the sun that is symbolized on this church, and not a man. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, we read, Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him. Let's read that again. Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him. The Son of God, and the light of the world comes with clouds, and every eye shall see him. Well, of course, there is only one light of the world that every eye can see, and that's the sun. In the scriptures, we can also read how Jesus walked on water. All of us, I'm sure, have seen the sunset. Now, we are also told that the Son of God died with a crown of thorns. No wonder. That is precisely how the sun was always pictured in ancient days, with a crown of thorns, or sun rays. So the crown of thorns on Jesus, the Son of God, the light of the world, are the sun's rays.
There is a phenomena that we call the precession of the equinox. It's a very interesting phenomena, a natural phenomena, that the sun, while we on Earth are circling or orbiting the sun itself is orbiting through the Milky Way galaxy. And it is going through the different constellations of the zodiac. And each time the sun leaves one of the constellations of the zodiac and goes into the next constellation of the zodiac, and that's all that old evil astrology. No, it's just history. It's just science. And each time it goes into it leaves one constellation and goes into another constellation, it enters the new constellation at the 30th degree. And it leaves that constellation for the next one at the 33rd degree. Therefore, God's Son begins his ministry to each one of his helpers at 30 and dies at 33.
The ancient calendar didn't start with the year of January or Janor, the double-headed god of Rome, as we do. Instead, they started their calendar in a different constellation. To be precise, the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin. Consequently, the Egyptians and the ancient Sumerian cultures said that the Son of God, who died on the cross and was resurrected in the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, born of a virgin. This is why, in front of a pyramid, you have a sphinx. The sphinx has the head of a woman and the body of a lion. This symbolized the zodiac overseeing the pyramid because, as I mentioned, their zodiac began with Virgo, the Virgin, the head of the Sphinx, and ended with Leo, the lion, or the body of the Sphinx, which symbolically was the complete zodiac.
Now, as we have seen, all the crucified saviors were in fact nothing more than personifications of the sun. And of course, that list goes on indefinitely back into ancient history. All races, creeds, colors, and movements have always personified their gods as the sun. But what about Jesus? It's true that he is referred to as God's Son, the light of the world, who is our salvation because he is risen. But how did the churches themselves picture their Messiah, this Jesus? Let's see what some of the pictures from the literature of churches, how they perceived their Messiah.
Those developments along the Nile, long time ago, we see some very familiar stories emerging in our religious lore. Later, the Jewish nation, as it came out of Mesopotamia, seemed to have attached itself to those very familiar stories and made them very much a part of the Jewish religion. As we take a look now at the Old Testament.
It is at this point I would like to remind that you should always be aware of any authority, institution, government, church, religion, anyone who is in position of any authority that tells you that you should not read something in particular, or you should not look at a set of facts or a particular book. Because usually anyone in authority who doesn't want you to read something in particular must have something to hide. Because the intellectual mind of the human being cannot grow if it is not allowed to look at all of the facts. We are told by Christianity that we're not to have anything to do with astrology, because that is evil and of the devil. Until we begin to look at the Old Testament with an academic eye, and not being swayed by religious conviction, but let's look at the actual Old Testament in the language that it was written in. And we're going to find that the Old Testament, like the New Testament, is nothing more than the entire story of the zodiac. We have seen the New Testament is nothing more than astrology and sun worship. Now we see that the Old Testament is going to be nothing more than astrology. And one of the most important points that we want to bring out, one interesting point that we might bring out, is that the Hebrews, when they were in Egypt, were of course subject to the religion of Egypt. And at that time, Isis, spelled I-S-I-S. Isis, the female personification of wisdom, from whence of course we get Mary in the Catholic Church, the Mother of God. Isis was the female personification of wisdom, spelled, as I said, I-S-I-S. Later on, with the coming of Pharaoh Akhenaten, or Akhenaten, Pharaoh Akhenaten changed the worship in Egypt from Isis to Amun-Ra, or Amun-Ra. Of course, this is where we get the term Ray, R-A, or R-A-Y, for sun ray. So Amun-Ra became the chief deity of Egypt. Now, once the Hebrews left out of Egypt and went north into Palestine, they found a new god there of the Canaanites, a god that is referred to as the Ugaritic god of the Middle East. That god was El, or the planet Saturn. The Hebrews then picked up the worship of the planet Saturn, or El, the Ugaritic god, and combining the Isis worship with the Amun-Ra worship, and lastly with the El, Saturn, or the god El, they formulate their new land based on the three concepts of God: Isis, Ra, El, or Israel, I-S-R-A-E-L.
Mr. Michael Chandler.
Solomon, wise King Solomon, is the sun in three languages. Sol,
Sun.
Spanish, sun. The Eastern religions, Om, they chant Om for the sun, and On is Egyptian for the sun. Jonah is an example of the sun going through the equinox. However, in this particular case, Jonah is Semitic for the sun, and Jonah's living inside the fish, inside the whale for 3 days, which means the sun is at the winter solstice in the bellies and the bowels of the earth at the winter solstice and dying for 3 days. Now, Samson, the adventures of Samson is equated to the adventures of Hercules. Samson was a solar myth. He had 12 unusual exploits or adventures around the zodiac. His strength was in his hair, because in his hair were the sun's rays. When Delilah cut off his hair, in actuality, his rays were cut off.
In the Old Testament, we are told that Moses comes down from the mountain after receiving the law, and what does he find the Hebrews doing? He finds the whole nation worshiping a golden calf. Well, the golden calf was in fact nothing more than a personification of the sun again. The golden comes from the golden sun, and the calf comes from the astrological sign of Taurus. So the golden calf was God's son in his kingdom in the constellation or the zodiac constellation of Taurus, the golden calf, or the sacred cow, which is still worshipped in India today. And then, of course, the beginning of the new year, the more ancient Hebrews would blow the ram's horn. The ram's horn was, of course, celebrating the coming of God's Son, the Messiah, God's Son, the light of the world, who was going to come into his new 2,000-year kingdom in the age of Aries, the ram, the ram, sheep of God. Later on, the ram is called the Paschal Lamb, or the Lamb of God, which is Aries, the constellation of Aries, and that's why the Jews still today blow the ram's horn. And of course, in the old ancient Egyptian calendar, the month of spring was under Virgo, and therefore God's Son is born of a virgin. Virgo, the virgin, the astrological symbol. It's really rather simple once you understand the story.
The high priests of Israel would go out in the morning mist to find the manna from heaven. Those of you who have had the opportunity to study carefully will know that the word manna from heaven actually means mushrooms.
The manna from heaven was actually a mushroom, psilocybin, the magic mushroom. And there's many books have been written about the subject of the magic mushroom in the Middle East, and I think we all know that in the Middle East there is the problem with hashish for thousands of years, and the drugs have been floating around the Middle East for thousands of years. We find it in the Bible, the magic mushroom. We find in the scriptures that which is referred to as manna from heaven is a word which means mushroom. Therefore, the high priest of God would go out in the morning, and of course, that's where mushrooms grow, is in the mist, in the dew, in the morning. And they would pick the mushroom, the manna from heaven, and of course, consuming the manna from heaven, they began to talk to God. In the book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, Mr. John Allegro, who was commissioned by the State of Israel for research, substantiates the taking of the magic mushroom by the ancient Semitic fertility cults in their sex worship, which predated and influenced modern-day Judaism. As we see pictured here, a drawing of the high priest of Israel. This is what the high priest of Israel looked like. You will notice that he is wearing a peculiar headdress. The headdress is because of the manna from heaven that the high priest consumed in their worship. The Hebrew god El was in fact a more ancient Semitic god, Saturn. And that's brought out very well for us here in Archive Orientali. Here we find in this excellent article that the Star of David, the hexagram, is actually the star of Saturn. And that's why today Hebrews worship on Saturday, Christians worship on the sun's day, God's Son, the light of the world. And there's still a disturbance among religious circles today as to what the correct day of worship is the Saturday or Sunday. Well, it just depends on whether you're worshiping Saturn, the old ancient Hebrew god, or the Son of God, the light of the world, on Sunday. It really doesn't make much difference. It's all Egyptian. If you go back not to the Bible, not to Genesis, but to the most ancient writings in the world, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Rig Veda, you will find that in the ancient nations of the world, they had all the same identical stories. They had the story of the young boy that was swallowed by the great fish because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. They have the story of Nemo. The Babylonians had the great lawgiver who had golden hair and went up into the mountain of God. The mountain of God was the pyramid. He went up into the great mountain of God, and he received the great law, which becomes known as the Law of Hammurabi, the great Law of Hammurabi. And that law was given to, the Babylonians say, their great prophet, their great man of God, who went up into the mountains, King Nebo. King Nebo, the great lawgiver, who comes down from the mountain with the tablets of stone and gives the great law to the Babylonian people. Now, of course, the Egyptians picked that up, and you will find that in Egyptology, the Egyptians had the same story, but their great lawgiver was called Meses. Meses was the great, wonderful man with beautiful golden hair who went up into the holy mountain, the pyramid, God's holy mountain. And he received the law. And the great law he brought down with the tablets of stone. And when he saw, Meses saw that the Egyptians did not respect the divine law, he broke the stones and the great law. Now, of course, the Hebrews, taking that story, moving into Palestine with their worship of their god El, then comes the story of Moses. Moses is Meses. Meses is Nebo. It's the same story. It never stops.
Lastly, we would like to touch upon the Dead Sea Scrolls issue, because if you don't know it, there is a very big controversy around the Dead Sea Scrolls. Basically, it amounts to this. Those who have the authority and have control over the Dead Sea Scrolls do not want anyone else to have access to them, because they are afraid that if outside authorities are able to examine the Dead Sea Scrolls, it might by chance begin to cause questions in the Judaic-Christian community about the authenticity of both Judaism and Christianity. And of course, the powers that be would not be very happy with that. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Qumran, and they were a large group of old ancient documents written by ostensibly the Essenic Jews. And they have caused much controversy in Israel, chiefly because Israel, the holder of the Dead Sea Scrolls, does not want anyone else to read them. They will read, Israel says that they will read the Dead Sea Scrolls and tell us what they say. But the problem is the world academic community says we want to read it for ourselves, and Israel doesn't want anyone to read the Dead Sea Scrolls but themselves.
Some 40 years ago, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near Qumran. Just recently, the Huntington Library released microfilm of all the scrolls published so far for scholars worldwide. As a result, apparently the Israeli government is considering taking legal action against them, apparently based on an infringement of copyright. Well, that raises an interesting question. Whose copyright? The copyright of those who wrote them years ago and have been dead for many, many years? Or if they're God's words, then surely the copyright belongs to God. But if they are God's words, then surely the words belong to everyone, and there is no question of copyright, which raises another interesting question. Why would the Israeli government want to suppress their publication?
It's interesting that we read from the Time magazine of January 14th, 1991, that Mr. John Strugnell, the chief editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the man who was put in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls by the State of Israel, after spending many, many years as the editor-in-chief, came out publicly to give his view of what he had studied and the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he was quoted in a Jewish newspaper as saying that while he himself was not an anti-Judaist, he did declare, and I'm quoting from the Time magazine, that Judaism is a horrible religion with racist origins that in principle should not exist at all. The whole worship of the heavens is the story of the Old Testament. It is an encoded story that only those on the inside know. There is a story for the outside, for the ignorant, for the ill-informed. But the writers and those who are well-versed in Hebrew theology know that there is a second story interwoven into the story of the Bible.
Well, we know that for a lot of you, this may have been a difficult experience, going through all of this with us. But we want you to know where we're coming from here at TNT. We're not here really to challenge your belief systems. We're not here trying to shake the moral foundation that you've built in your lives with your religion. We just want you to analyze and look closely at the data, historical facts, about what you have let your life get into if you're closely involved in all of these things around you that you associate with religion and how that's affecting your life. Every little bit of it. What are you involved in? What are you believing in? What is all of this history we have seen? Does it really relate to you? Now, there's no doubt about the fact that a lot of the great things that are taught to us all in our religions have some value, that teach us to be good to each other, that teach us to be loving human beings. But we wonder about the religions that bring on rote and ceremony. Does that really do anything to make you a better person, a more godly person? Or are you casting it all under the guise of a myth? Myths got you nowhere. Ritual, rote, ceremony get you nowhere. It's what you are that counts. And can you find this godly you inside these myths? Or are you going to have to search someplace else for it? All we're doing is asking you to think very carefully about the information you have received here. It is valid. It is historical. If you believe some of the things you believe in, we feel that you have to believe in some enormous levels of consequence. But you're right, you can do that. But think about this. It might just change the way you view the entire world and the rest of your life.